Alright guys, welcome to part 3 of the Aquila display cabinet. So in the first two parts of the series, we got all of our casework fully put together, and now we're ready to move on to kind of putting the finishing touch on the casework here. Now this is kind of the whole reason that this project existed. At one point in time when I was at an antique store, I saw this beautiful antique cabinet where the outside was made from natural white oak, and when I opened the door to take a look at it, it had this beautiful painted dark green interior. And as soon as I saw that piece of furniture, I knew that I wanted to make something following that idea. Because what I really liked about this is that you have that awesome natural texture color on the exterior of the piece, but then on the inside you have just this little pop of color, and I found it so interesting. So when I was putting together the design for this project, I had initially designed it with that in mind, having the idea that I wanted to go through and paint the interior. And it worked out really well as I started working this project, and like I mentioned in the first video of this project, the wood that I ended up getting had a lot of problems. There was just a ton of sapwood in it, and I really didn't know how I was going to make it work. And that's where, again, this whole idea of painting the piece really just saved this entire project. Because now, all of a sudden, I could have all this sapwood hidden inside the cabinet, and it would just get covered in a layer of paint. Now, when it comes to painting furniture, there's a lot of very controversial opinions about it. Everyone has their own taste on what they think you should do. A lot of people think that you should never paint it. But for me, what I've found works the absolute best is when you spray it. And that is just about the only way that I will probably ever paint furniture, and using, I don't think the paint that you use matters too much. I've experimented with a lot of different stuff, everything from milk paint to a more modern paint like I'm using here. But what I found is the key factor is spraying it on. Because what you'll notice is as I go through and I'm spraying on this very light coat of this paint, is I'm spraying it on light enough that it has time to actually soak into the wood. And even though I'm working with cherry, which is not a particularly porous wood, so it doesn't have the ability to soak in a ton of the paint, it still soaks in enough that the wood grain is able to show through, which I think is such an important factor. Because one of the things that I like to do when, with the concept of painting the wood, is I don't want it to look like it's just a painted surface. I want it to still show that there is wood, that natural wood underneath. So it's kind of a compromise. On one hand, I like that wood texture, but I also want to kind of control the color. So again, it's all about, for me, is figuring out the right mindset. And about also figuring out a bit of a balance, because I think if I was to take this entire project and build it out of a cheaper wood and just paint the whole thing this dark green color, I don't think it would look as good as having that blend with that kind of natural cherry texture. And again, the other important factor here is your choices of everything. You really have to take the time to sit down and go and figure out what wood you want to work with, and then figure out what paint colors are going to complement that wood. And so this color that I picked out is called Jasper, and it's from Sherwin-Williams. This is the best color I ever could have hoped for. This is actually, I would say, my favorite color overall, and it's awesome that it blends so well with the natural cherry color. And so you've probably noticed that this project has been a lot about trying new things, trying to kind of push my boundaries and do things that are just a little bit different. And that's just one of the many reasons why this project ended up taking so long, is because on each step that I did, I had to kind of learn and figure out what I needed to do before I could just kind of jump in and do it. And everything to do with the whole painting part of it, this part went surprisingly well. It was a lot easier than I'd actually expected, because all it took was just taping off those edges, and then I could go through and clean everything up with the router like I'm doing here. But even to get to this point, I had to do a ton of testing, because one of the things I knew I would have to do in this whole process of painting the casework is I'd have to put these edge profiles in after I had the paint on there. And so when I was going through and I was testing out what paint I wanted to use, I was trying everything from milk paint to stuff from Home Depot, to this really nice Sherwin-Williams trim paint. I tried out all these different types of paint to figure out what was going to be the most durable. And so this Sherwin-Williams paint is, it's really, really nice stuff. It's actually way more durable than anything else I tested, which I was super impressed with. And the color is just great too. But the biggest thing is that in my testing, I was able to run that router bit over the edge without it damaging the paint at all. So that allowed me to go through, fully paint the interior of the casework, and then go over it with the router and put all of my final edge profiling on there. And that just helped me get a very crisp and clean finished line. Because when that router bit is cutting, it's leaving that just perfectly fresh shaped line on there. And I just found that that was the best way to go about doing it. I did try masking off the chamfer and all that kind of stuff in all of my different tests that I did before jumping into this project. But again, this was the way that I found was gonna work the absolute best. I also had to have a little bit of a debate in my head with these shelf pinholes as to how I wanted this thing to look. And what I ended up deciding in the end was to just leave the shelf pinholes natural cherry, because it helped bring up a little bit more interesting detail to the interior of the cabinet. Now when it came time to do the shelves, this is where I went through and I tried to pick out the best pieces of material that I had. The pieces that had minimal sapwood, or I knew I would be able to hide the sapwood just on kind of the back underside edges. I wanted these shelves to be as clean as possible because these are going to kind of be the most visible part of this cabinet when everything is all put together. And this is another good example of kind of figuring out a good hybrid approach to woodworking. Because you can see here, I started on the jointer, then I'm going over to the hand planes, and once I get one side cleaned up with the hand planes, then I'm going to go over to the planer and get these things down to a nice thickness. But again, it's all about kind of having a few different ways to work with your wood. Because sometimes your hand tools are going to give you the most freedom to approach different pieces of wood. Because again, you're always going to be limited with machinery as to how big your machine is. Right now I have a 6-inch jointer, a 13-inch planer, and those do have a decent amount of limitations to them. Whereas my hand planes, well, with my hand planes I can work with any size board that can basically fit in my shop, technically speaking. So it really opens up a lot of possibilities. Not to mention, it's fun to just kind of get your hands on a hand plane and just work the wood. It's a really enjoyable experience, whereas this is one of the things I will agree with a lot of hand tool users about. Using a jointer, using a planer, they're not really a fun experience. You're just passing a piece of wood through some spinning blades. But when you can get some nice, clean shavings on a hand plane, that is just awesome. So then, with the design of these shelves, I decided to use one of my most controversial designs, and I'm going to be doing some just normal breadboard ends. Now, I am constantly getting comments on some of my older videos where I've used breadboard ends for shelves from people saying that it doesn't disperse the weight properly because you're putting too much stress on those breadboard ends, and over time they're going to warp or break or bend because it just seems like people don't particularly understand how breadboard ends work. Now, I will admit, it does make some sense, logically speaking, that a breadboard end shelf is not going to be as strong as if you just had a straight piece of wood going from end to end. There is some potential for failure there because you do have that somewhat loose piece of wood attached to the end. But what a lot of people seem to not understand is that breadboard end joint is a very, very tight joint. Those shoulders are butted right up against the shelf panel, so there really isn't any room for them to bend or warp or twist. So this is one of those things where I don't bother arguing it in the comment section of my older videos, because to me it's a very straightforward thing. There's no possible way that breadboard end could really weaken that shelf, but again, there is some way I can see people coming up with those arguments. I can understand where they might think that there's some flaws, but I can also promise you that I've been doing this basically since I got into woodworking, and there's no problems with it. It's actually way more beneficial because it helps keep your shelf panels nice and flat. Plus, for me anyway, it adds in some extra visual detail. And honestly, more than anything else, it's the visual detail that is the reason that I keep doing breadboard ends on my shelves. I think that it just looks a lot more interesting because You know, when you open a piece of IKEA furniture and it has floating shelves, it's usually just a piece of wood in there. But in my case, right, with these very high-end pieces of furniture that I'm trying to make, I want to make them look more unique. I want to show off some of those joinery skills that I have. And again, just using breadboard ends is a simple but just great way to show off just a little bit of extra joinery. And again, I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, you know, not everyone likes that look of those exposed end grain joints on those shelves, on kind of on the inside of the cabinet. But for me personally, it's exactly the look that I've always liked. And one of the other funny things that I will mention about these shelves is that these are a true breadboard end. Everything you've seen me do up to this point, these are about as true of a breadboard end as you'd put on like a tabletop or anything. They've got room for expansion and contraction. These are very nicely made breadboard ends. So that's one of the things I've gotten called out for on some of my previous videos where people think that I'm not actually making a real breadboard end. I do put the effort in because, for one, I think it's fun, but also it's good practice. Because again, practicing on these little shelves, it's the same concept as if you were to make a giant tabletop. You know, it's just all about accounting for a little bit of wood movement and setting up your pieces so that they, you know, nothing is going to self-destruct. Now, one of the things I always find funny about working with anything that goes inside of a piece of furniture I make is you always have to start with these same few steps. Is we take our shelves or whatever it might be and get it perfectly squared up. So starting with the track saw, going over to the table saw, and then we'll finish it off with the shooting board to just get everything perfectly fit up and squared up. And then one of the special considerations with a shelf like this, again, because we use breadboard ends, is we want to make sure that we're keeping everything nicely centered. So when I first got the shelves all fit up, I put them in and I took a close look at them and I figured out how much offset I wanted to make room for both of our doors, as well as just a little bit of extra space. Then I was able to go through and figure out that I want to take 1/8 of an inch off of either side, and that would keep my shelves nice and centered. From there, I could take it over to the table saw, knock off those pieces, and we'd actually have these just perfectly fit up shelves. But then the interesting part is we have these perfectly squared up shelves that actually don't fit the cabinet very well. And so what I'd found as I was trying to fit up these shelves is that that back plywood panel, whether it was through the painting process or something, had slightly curved inwards. Now, this is pretty typical. Anytime you have a large but thin panel on a piece of furniture, it's going to have a tendency to warp around a little bit. So the simplest solution was to just slightly knock these shelves out of square. By just using my compass plane, I put a light curve over the back edge, and this allowed me to fit these shelves up absolutely perfectly. I did have to label them in order to make sure I keep them in the right order when we actually get this thing all finished off, but it did give me perfectly fitting shelves. And this just brings in the point of just focusing on the little details wherever possible. You know, I could have just left these shelves the way that they were, but by going through and just removing a little bit of material on that back edge with the compass plane, I was able to make sure that these shelves were sitting nice and flat against that slightly curved back panel. So as always, guys, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.